and I'm with the Virginia SBDC Network. For those of you that are not familiar with our organization, the Virginia Small Business Development Center is a partnership program between the U.S. Small Business Administration, George Mason University, and local host institutions throughout Virginia. With 26 locations across the Commonwealth, we provide training and technical assistance to small businesses in their local communities. Our one-on-one advising services are available at no charge. Today's webinar, Preparing Your Food and Beverage Production Business for Growth, is presented by the Virginia SBDC Network. We are recording today's presentation and it will be posted on our website, virginiasbdc.org. Due to the large number of participants, everyone's microphone is muted and the chat feature is turned off. But if you have questions during the presentation, you can type those into the Q&A box. We have also enabled the live transcript function, which you can show or hide via your own meeting controls. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the Virginia SBDC Craft Beverage Assistance Program Manager, Chris Van Orden.
Thank you, Sheila. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this conversation about preparing for growth in the food and beverage sector. My name is Chris Van Orden, and I'm the manager of the Craft Beverage Assistance Program here at the Virginia SBDC at George Mason University. The Craft Beverage Program is designed to provide industry-specific assistance to Virginia's craft beverage sector. Today's program is going to be a free-flowing discussion on how F&B businesses can develop and implement strategies to support sustainable growth. You can enter any questions that you have in the Q&A function, not chat Q&A, please, and we'll do our best to answer them all either during or after the webinar. So I'm very excited to welcome today's speaker, Brian Becker, founder of Becker Growth Strategy. Brian has deep experience working in and with for many food and beverage producers, most recently as COO of Well Found Foods, a fresh grab-and-go food manufacturer that supplies both wholesale clients and his own fleet of vending machines with fresh products to meet all days and all parts of the day and many dietary preferences. Previously, Brian served as the entrepreneur in residence and director of small business outreach at Catholic University of America. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you so much for being here. So before we dig in, can you just give a little bit of background on how you came to work in and with the F&B sector?
Sure. So I've always been a food and beverage guy. Even when I was in college or in the early parts of my career as an educator, I would be working in restaurants or bartending and working catering gigs and those kinds of things. In one occasion, I worked for the U.S. Open when it was housed at Shinnecock in Long Island. And there was all the tent villages and all the logistical nightmares involved with running a major event. So it was always an interest of mine. My family entertains a lot. So my sister worked for one of the larger caterers in DC for about a decade. So we're always kind of trying to figure out how to meet people with their needs and their palate preferences and to have a good time while doing it. So worked in a couple of brew pubs in DC on the early days of the early aughts when things were a lot different than they are now. I got a chance to see a lot of the renaissance of the food and beverage community in our nation's capital firsthand. And I tend to gravitate towards people who were the movers and shakers at that time, starting to initiate the food incubators and some of the breweries and distilleries and those kinds of things that popped up at that time. And so even while I had one foot in education, I was doing events like Northeast Eats, which I founded in 2017. To showcase local food and beverage production in that quadrant of the city. And on average, I would have about 300 attendees and about 30 vendors to showcase the production capacity and the friends that I'd made in the F&B sector. When I worked at Catholic, no surprise to anyone, about 75% of the student projects that we took on happened to be for F&B businesses. And then even some of the accelerators and smaller cohorts that we ran tended to be actually specifically craft beverage heavy. So worked with a lot of the brewers in town. With some of the kind of intellectual firepower of the university, I was also able to ride shotgun on a lot of these consultations that talked a lot about production capacity, talked a lot about growth strategy, diversification within the market, and quite frankly, how to figure out how to go from a local and potentially regional player into something more. So what it would take to get over that hump, which is then the skill set that I used when I worked at Well Found, trying to figure out the same thing. How do you go from a hyper local producer that had a service radius of about 30 miles when I started to about 50 miles when I left. And we had all kinds of inquiries from some of our channel partners to say, hey, could you go 200 miles? Could you go 250 miles? What happens when you enter into a new market? And so really we were preparing the business to answer some of those questions at every step along the way to give us better options for growth down the line. So now that I've started my own consulting firm, helping others answer some of these same questions, and in many cases, just asking the right questions before it becomes an expensive mistake.
Well, I know that experience will resonate with a lot of our audience. The widening of distribution footprints and logistical demands. That dealing with the food tents at a tennis tournament sounds like a particular kind of nightmare, but I guess a really good challenge for somebody up to it. So yes, that's very, very helpful for our audience here. But yeah, so looking forward to the discussion. Just to kind of set the table of what we're talking about here, can you describe kind of the type of growth scenario that is kind of that we're looking to cover today?
Sure. So I've given this a lot of thought, actually, and I think that there are certain challenges, of course, that are similar across industries for startups. There are specific challenges per industry for each startup. But really, some of these growth challenges really start to manifest themselves north of the $1 million a year in revenue mark. It's not to say that it's easy to get there, but just your challenges and your priorities have to change at that point. It also mirrors the transition between more friends and family and angel investor and family office investors that tend to be a little bit more narrative driven in where they place their investments, to taking that leap to accepting institutional capital. It's a different conversation. It's a different playbook. It's a different set of terms that's used. And really, most of the institutional investors aren't going to invest in only a regional opportunity. They are going to require a roadmap, at least, into how you're going to enter into different markets and to take a bigger swing so that they can get their tried and true rule of thumb of 5x in 5 years. So I think that a lot of the work that needs to be done as you go on that through that growth trajectory, people talk a lot about hockey stick growth. We're trying in this case to shorten the blade such that you can go up the shaft of the stick, so to speak, and really experience that rapid growth. But so much can happen in that preparation period that it looks like a flat blade, but there's so many ups and downs that happen on our way there. This is really preparing for that inflection point that's going to be rapid growth.
Yeah, and I like the term inflection point here, right? There's nothing wrong with staying at a manageable level, right? This is a very good business model, often depending on the sector you're in, depending on where you're at and what your resources are, even just your choices about what kind of life you want to lead. But if we're talking about building for growth, right? It's a different mindset. You're going to have different resources you need to put in place. And if you hit that inflection point and you're trying to really accelerate, and that's great. I mean, there are some rules of thumb, but I think it's helpful, right, to kind of just say how a company might recognize when they're at this point. So in your experience working with companies at this stage and your own experience helping to guide Well-Found through this kind of growth, how would you say that founders can tell that they're approaching that inflection point that requires new thinking, new resources, new strategies, all that?
Sure. One of the questions that we developed, and actually I'll give a shameless plug here for the toolkit that I developed for the SBDC beverage program. It's all about a roadmap to different types of funding. And so there's a few questions, there's actually 10 of them that you should ask. I think the most important one is something you already hit on. Is this a lifestyle business or is this a growth business? And that's an internal decision. Before you start taking on capital from various types of sources that have their own opinions about which type of business you should be, you need to figure that out for yourself. And I'll give you a pretty good example. I was at a conference in Atlanta probably 5 or 6 years ago with my students from Catholic, and there was a business who made skincare products. It required refrigeration, so there's definitely some relevance to the F&B space. Apparently, whatever she did with her product was so revolutionary that Whole Foods wanted to pick it up and take her nationwide. And so all of the kind of Shark Tank judges that were up there as she presented says, okay, this is your moment. This is the inflection point. Here's how you lean into that. You accept X amount of dollars, you build out your capacity, you go nationwide, you find a co-packer, you do all these things. Let's go. And the founder, to her credit, knew her priorities and had that. She'd already asked herself this question. She says, I want to be able to see and know my customer. So when people come to my spa in Atlanta, yes, they can see that the product is made there, but we also have a spa attached to it. And I like knowing that this particular skincare product solves types of eczema, so on and so forth, particular to the African American community. She said, this is something that I want to know my customer. That's not the life I want to live, regardless of what the opportunity could be. Now, different founder, different scenario, probably would have said, okay, axe the spa. Here's this, we have this tailwind we need to catch, and let's go ahead and take this big swing. I don't want to even see another, lid being put on a jar. I'm going to build out the production facility in the most efficient way possible to go nationwide, and we're going to take this opportunity. Those are two different stories, but for her credit, she was very happy having a lucrative lifestyle business that probably had a couple less zeros than in the total pie, but she had a bigger piece of that pie. And that was the life she wanted to live. So I think that some soul searching has to happen before people start throwing money at you, even if you have one of these incredible inflection points or opportunities that come your way. And I think a lot of the discernment that has to take place whenever you have an opportunity like this is, one, is this the direction I want to go in? But two, can we actually go there if we wanted to? So do the processes that we've put in place support rapid growth? Can we take a huge purchase order on and fulfill that order without there being all kinds of consequences for people's sanity and mental health and even physical health? And not to mention that what happens if one of your key pieces of equipment goes down, so on and so forth. Playing out all these scenarios, a lot of people, I think, like to do the financial modeling or like to look at it because they just look at the zeros that tend to accumulate. But you also have to look at the personal and the time costs and investment required to get to where you want to go. Again, assuming that's what your end goal is.
Yeah, I think that's it sounds like some of these these examples came from personal experience too, about a key piece of equipment going down and then what. But yeah, I think it's helpful, right? What are your goals here? What resources do you command? What do you have to add to chase this? Sometimes it's an opportunity put in front of you. Some of it is more proactive in finding that. From my experience, there's like a breakdown that I've heard that was really helpful for me to understand things too, which is capacity versus capability. And it's saying, hey, yeah, you might be able to turn on the spigot theoretically. I could double production, but there's all kinds of then what down there. Like, do you have the people to run the new machines? Okay, well, you need to hire a new expert. You need a new, really top-notch new mechanic to run the new packaging line. Do you have that person in your network? If not, what does it take to get that person? How many resources does it tie up just for this one new thing? Never mind, is your distribution partner capable of executing these? Right? These are all these knock-on of things. It doesn't mean that it's not worth doing, but right, it's not enough just to say, yeah, like I can beat this one order. There's so many things. These are all these businesses that grow up kind of incrementally while we're talking about a different kind of growth, which is why we're having this discussion. It's not just linear, oh, well, I need to hire another person to work this shift. We're talking about rethinking how you do business.
Sure. And I think another way to address that same question in kind of very basic business school terms is it's just a SWOT analysis, right? And it's, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? What are your opportunities? What are your threats? In our case at WellFound, the moment we took the opportunity to bring distribution in-house, then we had a threat, which is that if a truck goes down, or as the case might be, we had 2 trucks get into an accident, both of them the week after we brought distro in-house and took it away from our third-party provider.
Not
Stuff
with
like
each
that
other, I hope.
happens. No, thankfully, but they might as well have, to be honest. That's okay so long as the trade-off is worth it. And I think that we were able to just anecdotally reduce our distribution costs from, I think it was almost 10 percentage points by bringing it inside. That was a part of a larger gross margin play that we were making at the time, and we were kind of tightening down all the nuts and bolts to make our next move. But I think that all that's to say, you have to evaluate. Every founder is very familiar with trade-offs and prioritizing, but continually reprioritizing and knowing that rapid growth requires a certain prerequisite set of instructions that you don't really have an option. Like, you have to grow or else once you take on a certain amount of capital. And that's different than saying, okay, I might disappoint some family and friends, or I might have to call the angel investors and say, hey, it's taking twice as long. Those are very different conversations than the folks that have their own models about what your returns are going to be, or else they're not going to give you any more money or any more attention. And so wading through those kinds of decisions, and really the people behind it all are not to be lost in all this, to think, what are the core competencies of your team? And as a founder, knowing in the back of your head that the mantra that we adopted with WellFound is, what got us here won't get us there. And to make it a little more personal, you don't say this part out loud typically, but the people who got us here might not get us there. And that's a tough thing to articulate, but to know that, okay, like, I might not be the guy to run a national or even global distribution company. I'm probably not. But as far as the regional stuff we were doing, I think I was. And I think that that's using myself as an example. When you look around and say, okay, what does this team need? And that also factors into the strengths and weaknesses and those kinds of things on the personnel side. It's much easier to stay one hire ahead of the needs, even though it seems like a waste of money. Because if you have the exact right number of people for the time, you're already behind, especially if you have intentions of growing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. All this stuff takes time, and the balance of skills, right, within an organization really needs to be calibrated all the time. It's hard, right? It's business. It's nice when it works at that personal level, but especially when you're going for growth, there's not a lot of room for inefficiencies or learning on the job, right? People need to be executing just because you're speeding. There's acceleration to all this.
That's right. And I also think that the cold hard truth that employees 1 through 10 and 10 through 20 and then 20 plus are not going to have the same level of personal investment as that scale continues on. So, you hire somebody when the company is just, for example, 5 years old, you're doing $2.5 million in revenue or something like that, or $5 million in revenue, and you hire employee number 32 to be, a fulfillment manager, for instance. There's no way that they're going to have the kind of visceral connection and loyalty to the company that your first fulfillment person did, who stayed till midnight because people called out or whatever it was. And, the people that have been through the battles with you and the wars with you and have the scars to prove it, like, they also have a personal timeline too. They're not going to stay in this forever unless all their new priorities are being met and their new needs are being met. So it takes a little bit of a shift in terms of how you onboard people and how you manage them, also to say, look, like, even the job, you tell employee number 10, the job description I just hired you for likely will be irrelevant in 6 months. They're like, okay, whatever, it's a startup, I signed up for this. You tell employee 25 that typically, and they're like, cool, that's when I look for another job, because that's not what I was hired to do. That's the change. And it doesn't make them bad people. It's just, it's a different skill set.
Yeah, different math for sure. So talking about people and the need to think about your team and the talent that you have on your team, can you talk a little bit about some of the other areas that a company that's poised for new growth decides to pursue that growth, right? Because it is a decision. Like, what are some of the main categories that they're going to need to invest in to kind of realize those opportunities?
Sure. I think we had people well covered. There are 2 other P's, I think. I think it is production capacity and then processes. So you mentioned that you can calculate your production capacity, but that's theoretical. It is, if you run your canning and bottling line 24 hours a day and you couple that with how much beer you can actually produce, and you put those 2 numbers together, if everything goes perfectly. That's not a true number, but at least it's a number you can work with.
Mm-hmm.
If then you have an opportunity, say, to enter into a new market or have a new distribution channel that is going to radically change your required output, you can maybe look at that number, that theoretical number, and say, okay, if we do this and when we do this, something's got to change. Either we look towards a contract brewer, perhaps, or we look towards an additional canning line that can be brought in temporarily. Something's got to change in order to make that even theoretical production capacity worth it. And that's, you're talking about CapEx stuff here, where these are capital expenditures that are going to be not necessarily recoverable should you go backwards. Like once you make this decision, that's your new reality. If that's what you're, and then I think processes also factors into that. So how smoothly running is your engine? If you have a 1982 beater that like leaks a bunch of oil, but it gets you from here to there, okay, it gets you from here to there, but at what cost? Also, with what threat to your being able to function? Herculean efforts are wonderful for startups, but that's not a plan. And so you need to make sure that your processes and even how you take on orders, how you fulfill orders, everything that happens from order being placed to order being fulfilled and then distributed, all of that has to be pretty smooth. And it has to be really smooth. And the fire drills that happen and all the snafus and all these other things that are common to operational challenges, they should really be kept at a minimum. Things are going to happen, sure. You're going to have the delivery van that gets into an accident. You're going to have the canning line that goes down. But what do your contingencies look like? Do you have that 24-hour mechanic you can call? Do you have some kind of service contract for preventative maintenance to at least hedge your bets? Really, how run is your program? Because the attention of the founder and of the leadership is going to be on other things that walk in the door. Let's say you have a ticked off partner or a ticked off client that is a super high level client. You might burn half a day or a full day making them happy, which doesn't now allow you to be the one to fix the canning line if you're the only one with that knowledge. And I think that I use this metaphor a lot with my team. If you follow racket sports at all, there are unforced errors versus forced errors. Like, look, if somebody beats you, like aces you on every serve, like you just got beat. But if every time you are in position to return the ball and you just send it into the stands, that's an unforced error. And a lot of times with my team, I would say, look, things are going to happen and we are equipped and we're ready to handle that. But what we can't do is address those unknown problems that come our way and not handle the ones we can control. Like, I don't want to hear about lost van keys again. I don't want to hear about the fact that we ran out of labels because you're supposed to be taking monthly inventory and there's a lead time to get more. And oh, by the way, we can't ship anything that doesn't have the proper label on it, as you know. So like, these are the kinds of things that it's a disciplined approach to process management that needs to be really ironed out before you take this big swing into rapid growth. And I'll give you a very specific example. We signed on with a large wholesale client that had as a requirement in the contract to be one of their providers. We had to have a 98.5% accuracy on count every time we shipped them something. So the relationship started small. It was only, 100, 150 items twice a week or something like that. But let's say that we forgot to deliver one of the boxes, that could void the entire contract. Because when you're dealing with these larger players in the F&B space, all they really care about is consistency and price, of course. But once they go down this road with you as a partner, you had damn well better perform. And I've heard this described in other ways by other folks. If let's say that Target comes calling and they want 1 million units, cool. You get one shot at that. If all of a sudden that's the day your jarring line breaks or whatever else you're in out of labels or whatever, the moment that they don't receive their delivery, that relationship is over and they're not coming back.
Mm-hmm.
So on the flip side of this, like, growth opportunity side, and I don't want to sound like I'm negative about it. The whole point is you got to make sure you have all your little ducks in a row, because once you get to the big table with the big boys, like, you had better be able to perform. And for your own team's sanity and safety, it shouldn't take a ridiculous effort in order to do that. And to your point about capacity versus, sorry, I forgot the other half of that.
Capability. Yeah.
Capability. Yeah. You can drive with your feet if you want to. It doesn't mean you should. So, like, it's, you got to make sure that you're in a good spot to keep those promises, because these people don't play the further you go up the food chain.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, again, lifestyle versus growth. That's a part of the trade-off.
Yeah, that is just part and parcel with what this kind of growth looks like in reality, right? You're dealing with players with different priorities, different motivations, and that's the reality of it. And I want to highlight a couple of things that I thought that you points you made that I thought were really important, about the importance of getting things right and fine tuning when you're small, right?
Mm-hmm.
Acceptable margin of error when you're small. Hey, 5%, whatever, you make it up. It's a case of something. Well, that becomes really big as you get bigger, and those fixes become more expensive, and you're running at full pace, right? So investing, especially looking forward and getting those people on there to make sure that you're right before you make that first shipment to Target or
Mm-hmm.
Food Lion or whoever it might be. It's much easier to do that when small. And I think that your point about, right, there's all the different things that can happen here, and so it's thinking about what the weakest link is, or the bottleneck for your company, right? That theoretical capacity, like, and that goes for process too, of just, well, what's the thing that's going to keep us from getting to 90% efficiency or 95% capacity, whatever that is. It could be your packaging line. It could be, hey, we can only move so many pallets around on our loading dock in a day because we're hamstrung by the whatever, right? All these little things.
Mm-hmm.
I know, I'm sure everybody here that's listening in has tales of woe about their physical space of just, well, we cannot, unless the truck has a lift gate, then we have to hand pallet jack down, and it winds up taking, and like, yeah, that's fine when you have a distributor who's picking up 2 pallets. But if you're trying to fill a 20-foot, 40-foot container and they're moving really fast, they're not going to give you that spare time to hand pallets down there. So these are the kinds of things that getting these fixes in place early really necessitated. This is why it's important. And all of these things, right? This is getting to another topic, which I'm sure is top of mind for everyone. To write these things, to basically get them in good shape for growth, requires money. So let's talk a little bit about capital. You mentioned the sort of guide that you developed for the SBDC. If there's ever anybody who's interested in just helping this is kind of a choose your own adventure tool about what's the right type of capital for me, for my aspirations, you can always reach out to us and we can, share some of this guidance with you. But how do you help companies think through their strategy for developing the financial resources necessary just to realize the kind of growth that we're talking about here?
Sure. I would say that food and beverage operates wholly differently than a lot of different industries, in the fundraising space, for a few reasons. One, and I think I used this example on one of the talks I gave recently, like, from a pure venture capital perspective, food and beverage isn't attractive for the reasons that it is. I think I actually have pulled the quote up here beforehand. Mark Cuban said, the category he shows is the hardest ever because it's either expensive to ship, it's expensive to store, it's expensive to get shelf space for them. And in his estimation, you need $50 million in sales to really have an impact. Now, that's a bit of an exaggeration, and he's a shark, and he was angling for I think the person who was on stage. However, I think that tends to be the rap that people have on food and beverage. Everybody knows somebody who has invested in a restaurant and lost their shirt, and they have no chance of getting their money back. Everybody knows that it's a thin margin business. And to Cuban's point, yes, it's hard. Distribution is extremely hard in the consumer package. You can move a bunch of candles around, or you can move a bunch of perishable product around. Most people would choose candles if they're given the choice. And I think that it's hard, but so is one of the most tangible things that I can think of. Everybody, whether they drink alcohol or not, is a consumer of food and beverage, so they understand it. They understand that there are certain things they like and certain things they don't, and certain things they're willing to pay a little bit more for. Generally speaking, it's cool to be an F&B person, right? I mean, I think that if you're at a cocktail party and like so and so's in cybersecurity and so so's in software sales, no offense to them, but so owns a barbecue joint, like I'm talking to the barbecue guy, or so is a distiller or a brewer. That's where I'm going to find myself, and I think there's a lot of people like that. People also tend to associate food and beverage brands with a sense of place. And so before we got on, you were talking about going to Spokane. And I was like, oh, I know a buddy who has a brewery in Spokane. You should go visit. Like, there's something to that. I'm traveling around the country and I want to get a taste, literally, of what it's like to live here. And I think that there are a lot of people who feel that way. The one major headwind that the entire industry is facing right now, and it's not specific to food and beverage, but I think it's particularly acute for us, is that the market has been a disaster in the last couple of years. The access to capital for founders has gotten even tougher. And in many cases, money was flowing so freely in 2021 and 2022 that a lot of founders were tempted to make some riskier plays. And then by the time that kind of filters its way through the market, many of the venture capital and other institutional investors have had to shore up their existing portfolio companies as opposed to finding new ones. So for the purposes of today's discussion, getting over that hump from the seed to Series A type money, to going from roughly $1 million and less in terms of a raise size to 2 to 5 to 10 million and more, that's gotten harder for everyone, but especially for our industry. But I will also say that the industry is ripe for disruption, particularly because of the pandemic now. I think that a lot of people's patterns have changed. I think that a lot of people's buying preferences have changed, and even their comfort with how they want to eat and drink has changed a little bit. And quite frankly, a lot of companies have exited the market for a variety of reasons during the pandemic or in the years that have followed. So I do think that there's opportunity out there to fill those voids. And the last thing that gives me, I think, encouragement is that the big players in food and beverage are starved right now for innovation. I've had many conversations, which is we've tried to do something like you're doing, but we've been unsuccessful. And also, getting back to the consumer preference side of it, you don't want to have, and I'm not going to pick on anybody in particular, but you don't want to have like cool new concepts sponsored by big behemoth company that I don't really want to eat from if I have the choice. They would rather have you nested within their portfolio and just say cool new concept, and not have people necessarily know or care that you are under this giant kind of global food and beverage umbrella. So I think that so long as you are operating in such a way that you are truly better than your competitors and you have a different offering that is truly unique, I do think that there are exit opportunities out there that maybe would not have been present prior to the pandemic. But it is navigating that landscape is difficult. And I think that, some mistake that people make is they think, all right, well, I found this XYZ venture capital firm. They're really more focused in tech and cybersecurity, but I know somebody over there. Maybe they'll invest in my food and beverage business. 3 years ago, you probably wouldn't have gotten them to bend their thesis for you. Today, you absolutely will not have them bend their thesis for you. Money's just tight, and most of them will tell you outright on their website what types of businesses they invest in. Don't waste their time.
Hmm.
This is not a like, ooh, I'm a great salesman. I can bend their ear and change their mind. No, like it's not like that, because it's not the person you're on the phone with. It's the people that they took money from who said only spend money on certain things. And everybody's special, but nobody's that special. so, so I think that the best advice I would give in the fundraising space is conduct an exercise like the tool that we had talked
Hmm.
about, where you're at least asking yourself the right questions so you can at least target the right type of funding. Then you do your research to find the funding providers within that category who are interested in what you provide, because they're not going to be flexible, especially given current market conditions, if they're not outwardly interested in what you have to offer.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, really focusing only on open doors, you could spend a lot of time having fruitless conversations, I don't know, annoying a lot of people by pitching what might be a very good idea for growth, but to the wrong audience. And yeah, it's just, if it's not in their mandate, I mean, they would get, whoever you're talking to would get in a lot of trouble if they supported you. So, hey, and the same goes for lenders too, right? I mean, this is
Yep.
this is how it goes, right? If your raise does not match their criteria for whatever it might be, that's where groups like the SBDC, as well as peers, right? Finding out elsewhere who else has had successful experiences, especially if they've had a good track record of kind of producing for this capital provider. Those warm introductions can really help. I mean, I'll say this is also in the absence of the ability to have really solid projections anymore. The industry has turned over many times in the if you're doing 5 and 10 year pro formas, right? Like, or you certainly, I think the event horizon for some of these investments, right? A new packaging line, yes, how long you need to run it. Well, who knows what's going to happen 10 years from now? So, right, going in with those warm introductions and seeing what's there, going to people that are at least understand how your interest rate functions, it's going to help a lot instead of having to explain how wine works to someone.
I think that's right. And the one thing I would like to add is that we we've only talked really about equity type funding to this
Hmm.
point. Um, if you are a seasoned business that does have the banking history that you can apply for a loan, right now the interest rates aren't necessarily in your favor, and the criteria has gotten a little bit tighter. But I will say the big difference between seeking debt financing versus equity is there's no mandated growth timeline for that. So long as you make your payments, they don't really care necessarily what your revenue is. Whereas if you go down the road of the equity investor, they are going to care what the
Hmm.
top line revenue is and how quickly you're getting there, because they're under the same time crunch they put on you. They're also under, given their with their LPs. And so I think that can be a better option, but it also tends to be a slightly, if we're talking about shortening that blade on the hockey stick,
Hmm.
the debt funding tends to elongate the timeline just a little bit, because it's
Hmm.
less of a big cash infusion, and it's a little more tied to what you can justify in terms of a monthly payment over 10 years,
Yeah.
as opposed to the equity stuff, which is, hey, I'm gonna I'm gonna place this bet and I'm gonna either hit or not very shortly.
Yeah. It results in all kinds of differences within the company, right? That's just, even if you have a similar raise in terms of just money through the door, where it come from, how it's structured, it's going to have a huge, huge impact on the daily lives of everybody who's in there, right? How hard are you pushing? Is this more about stability? And there's no single right answer. I mean, only in retrospect will you say, oh, if I had taken this money and not that, you never know, right? The
No,
world's a complex place, but you do your math and you make the best informed decision possible.
that's right. I mean, there's no benefit to playing Monday morning quarterback as a
Mhm.
founder. There just isn't. You do the very best you can with the information that you have at any given time. But then the challenge becomes, how much information can I get at any given time before I make this decision? And I mean, that's where a lot of the strategy comes in. Do you know your capacity? Do you know all of these possibilities? Because then you can make a more informed decision, as opposed to just saying that seems like a good idea. How quickly do I need to repay this loan, or how quickly do I need to achieve certain revenue numbers in order to make the VCs happy, which is kind of the conversation that ends up happening.
Yeah, that is what you spend a lot of time doing after a while. And hey, it's all right. It's all in the service of, a sort of bigger goal, and that's right for some people. So thinking about, right, we've obviously been talking about this sort of finance side, and we've touched on human capital. We've touched on some of the processes and things like that. Given that, right, food and beverage is a complex logistical industry, right? This is just the nature of it. Sometimes it's more complex than others. I mean, my background is beer, right? We're talking cold chain and all of these things, heavy liquids. Your experience of having kind of ready to eat meals that are very quick turnarounds and shelf life and all of these complex settings. I think this is going to be a top of mind issue for a lot of people. So if companies are preparing for this kind of growth, what kind of guidance would you have for them about dialing in their logistics game, make sure that they're setting themselves up for success?
Sure. I think this also is a part of the kind of process audit that I'm advocating for. I think that seeing where your systems maybe have a little bit of slack, seeing where they're pretty tight, and trying to figure out, is there anybody or any resource that can help me either automate or streamline this process? So, for instance, we didn't have a routing software for our vans until we reached a certain service area and a certain number of routes and everything. It became a little too dependent on what was in my head or other people who were from the area in terms of the best way to go from A to B at a certain time of day. We have since invested in a routing software that has made that a lot easier. There's no more guesswork. You much more kind of a la minute. You press a button and it tells the driver where to go next. Any number of things can happen between by the time the driver leaves and the time that he gets back to the facility. So instead of him calling me and saying, "Hey, the White House is closed because there's a dignitary in, what am I supposed to do?" He would then press that button. It would route him somewhere else, knowing that he had to come back there soon. I think that when you start talking about co-packers, and you start talking about contract brewing, I'm more familiar with the beer space than spirits and wine, but I think that there can be efficiencies gained there. However, they're not. There are very few silver bullet solutions to any of these problems. On the one hand, life was a little more simple for us when we had a third-party distro team, but then it was more cost efficient. We had more control when we brought it in-house. So when the third-party team missed a delivery, they would say, "Sorry, we couldn't get in," and they would bring it back, and then we'd have to scramble the next day to bring it out. Now we have a different set of SOPs really to kind of make sure all that stuff happens. As far as the cold chain and everything goes, there are, as I'm sure everybody knows, there are various tools which make traceability and tracking a lot easier, and some are better than others. So maybe it is that big contract opportunity that you're pursuing that says, you know what, let's do a little less of the we're going to have a little probe thermometer that sits in the van, and then the batteries run out and we kind of figure. I mean, all these things happen, and a little bit more of the it's time to invest in a higher end cold chain verification system, maybe. Same goes for I'm sure labeling and canning lines and stuff like that. All of our stuff was all hand packed, so I'm not as familiar with those kinds of things. But if you can justify tooling up in some of these areas, I think that that's helpful. I had to learn over time. We got all of our packaging by full shipping container from China. I had to figure out which of the best carrier I didn't have a whole lot of options getting it from China to the port, but then it was always an adventure getting it from the port to our warehouse. So I figured out there were a couple of people, especially in the port of Baltimore, who I could call, and they were the most reliable. Okay. You can start working on those things. Like, you mentioned lift gates earlier. When we were moving machines around, I knew which U-Haul facilities actually had trucks with lift gates and which Penske reps actually called you back. So thinking through all of these different contingency plans and saying, all right, like, again, SWOT analysis, what's hard for us now, because it's likely only going to get harder. And if we can calibrate now, it's a lot easier potentially, and we have the time to think about it as opposed to trying to do it on the fly when the rocket ship's taken off. So I think that the SWOT analysis that I mentioned earlier, I should add, that was something we did, I guess, monthly at our leadership meetings, because my interpretation of what the SWOT analysis would read from the chair that I sat in might be very different from the person that ran distribution, or the person that ran fulfillment, or the person that ran culinary, or the person that ran sales. And I think that giving them that opportunity to provide that feedback, that they'll say something in passing that is actually a very correctable error. They'll say something like, gee, the last time I was out out in the field, I noticed that, we were out of, I don't know, like wipes for the screens or something like that. It's like, well, nobody told me, I'll make an Amazon order and we'll have all the wipes for screens that we could possibly need. But that all matters because let's say one of our big contract people happened to walk by a machine at the airport and it had fingerprints all over the screen. His impression is that we're not as worthy of this big opportunity, because the hills have eyes. Again, is once you kind of make this decision, you've got to be your best all the time, or at least more consistently than maybe you were at a smaller stage when it's kind of a nice little regional or local company.
Yeah. Gosh, yeah. So many things to balance. And I like that the kind of emphasis on like the feedback loops here, right? Within the companies, right? You make investments, you add tools, right? You kind of do that cost benefit of when we reach this threshold, this is when we invest in the tool that's going to do this, because it takes one person 1 hour to do this at 10 units of analysis or whatever. Well, when you get to 100, then all of a sudden that's an entire job dedicated to that, which offsets costs. And of course, relying on your partners, knowing that even whether it's on your own team or if you have a third party distributor, obviously alcohol producers have that. Food and beverage may or may not. Food or non-bev alc, but non-bev. Those folks are going to have right, the option there, but whatever it is, making sure that you're getting the feedback so that you can make those adjustments, because something that goes unnoticed or unreported is not going to be fixed. And it's really painful when you find out that, hey, this opportunity is not going to work because of something that was correctable. Like you said, that unforced versus forced errors metaphor really resonates, where if you get beat, if somebody makes a product just like yours and it's 20% less and they're skilled up, like, okay, so be it. But it's really frustrating when you find out you missed an opportunity for something that you could have addressed.
Sure. Yeah. And one of our biggest challenges was inventory management for the perishable product. So we used to take our sent versus sold reports by hand for each location, and we would do like a very rudimentary, like literally sharpening the pencil exercise for each machine to figure out what to send for the next one. When we had 10 or 15 machines, that was somewhat doable. It took half the morning. When we got to 80, like there's not a human being out there who can do that, or enough time in the day. So we actually built an algorithm that ingests all the live sales data, and then it generates reports, but it still has a kind of human handler to make sure that, if the Senate's out of session that week, then they'll scale back, or if, Georgetown's on spring break or whatever. But what we also found is that the unforced error of sent versus sold, the forced error of like inventory management being a bugaboo for us. And it's just really challenging given the nature of our product in the market. But then let's say that there was a phantom order that somehow, 100 burritos and 100 of each sandwich got processed, even though the client had canceled it. All of a sudden, all of this work we made to reduce waste on the one side got completely overshadowed by this completely stupid unforced error. And like those are the ones that like I still think about, even though I'm out of the mix now. It's just like, God, we spent a month and a half trying to get our spoilage number down to X%. And then we had one snafu on the wholesale side, and all of a sudden it's like all of those gains were minimized or rendered useless.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's it's a good thing to think about, right? Yes, the controlling what you can and the fine tuning the things that matter. I mean, there's orders of magnitude questions sometimes of getting things right and, knocking out the really important things first. That can be, you might say, oh, I can understand how to address this one issue. Well, if that's not the really thing that's going to move the needle between a victory and a loss, then maybe there's other things you need to look at.
Sure. Yeah, I had a mentor that used to say, don't let the urgent get in the way of the important. And I think as a leader, that's pretty sage advice, that there are certain things that will move the needle that you might need to sit in a quiet space to think through for a couple hours, even though you might be getting calls from drivers saying that like X site's closed and I was missing this on the order and like all the other stuff. But the true growth strategy is going to be will hinge upon your ability to focus on the important things that truly move the needle, and everything else either needs to be kind of automated or addressed or delegated. Because you know more about your business than anybody else, and if you're going to make these big decisions, you're gonna need the headspace to do it.
Yeah. And I know you won't say this, so I will. So that's where, bringing in outside expertise, whether, SBDCs can help with a lot of areas when it comes to growth strategies in food and beverage sectors, experts like you, right? This is where having somebody to hold you accountable to sit down and put in the work or give you the tools necessary. There's a certain level of growth that you can support from within. And then there's a certain point where you need to bring in outside experts, not necessarily to do the work, but equip you to do the work. And that can be a hard thing to recognize, but helping to discern the important from the urgent. I think that's like a really important distinction to make after, maybe at a certain point when your company's just so big, somebody spills something in the tasting room, it shouldn't be on you anymore.
That's right.
So we're nearing the end of our time here. I just wanted to ask a couple of kind of common closing questions here. So with all of your experience in the industry here, especially, supporting companies in that growth stage, what are the most common mistakes you see? And if you feel like giving us, the worst mistake without mentioning any names, anything that you might say that you see in this space, companies kind of make a wrong turn.
Sure. I mean, one thing that I've seen most recently, and a lot of this has to do with just the changes the world has endured over the last 4 years or so, is that a lot of companies took on a lot of debt because money was cheap. For from 2020 to 2022 or so, money's decidedly less cheap over the last 2 years. And I've seen companies, once I kind of get a chance to peek under the hood, I'm like, well, wait a minute, we're solely focused on this like break even or profitability goal, but there's a significant chunk of money that is reserved to debt service on a monthly basis that makes it really difficult to hit those goals. I think that a lot of people assume that the next round of funding is always coming. And so they're like, cool, we're going to raise our Series A. It's going to clean up our cap table. It's going to wipe out all this debt service and like off to the races we go. But that assumes a certain valuation that might not be in your control. So with the larger market forces, it could very well be that you've done everything right, but the going rate for a company like yours, the valuation associated with it is not nearly as high. And again, that's specific to a life cycle snapshot in time for a business. It doesn't really matter as much when you're raising on convertible notes or safes because there's not an established valuation and it's kind of fluid and there's a longer timeline there. As soon as you have your first price round, most commonly your Series A, like that valuation is going to matter because it locks in all the previous arrangements, it locks in all the future arrangements, and it locks in where everybody sits. And, I've seen a lot of founders in the last few years get like significantly diluted with their own stake in the company, such that it becomes this kind of runaway train, and they owe a bunch of money to a bunch of people, but also their end of the rainbow scenario is not nearly as shiny as it used to be. And that, I think, on a personal level is where people get frustrated. So I would just say, like, be conservative in your projections. As you mentioned earlier, control what you can, with an eye towards weathering the other challenges that will come your way. And I think that just keeping an eye on that, like, debt to revenue ratio, I think is really important. And also, if you're doing your SWOT analysis regularly, you're going to inevitably talk about market conditions and competition and those kinds of things. Or if you really want to double down on the competition side of it, you can look up Porter's 5 Forces and do a deep dive on that. And I think that those are the kinds of things that to put yourself in the best position to succeed and give yourself the most information to make your decisions. I think that's one way to hedge your bets in that way. But I will also say that there's nothing wrong with being a lifestyle business. And I think that that's something that some of the sharpest founders that I've engaged with realize. They're like, listen, I don't need to provide a 5x return in 5 years or more in order to make a bunch of people I barely know happy. I'm good so long as we can continue to hit our goals, we continue to service our debt, and we continue to employ the people that we care about and provide the product to the market that we love. That's okay. This whole growth stage stuff isn't for everyone. And I think part of my goal for today was to make it clear to people that it's a hard place to go. There are some best practices and some things to think about along the way. But I will say, if somebody were to tap me on the shoulder and just say, hey, would you rather have a like predictably profitable business and you get a chance to have a pretty good work-life balance and to bring your product to the world, at least in kind of a little way, I'd probably choose that 9 out of 10 times. The growth trajectory is really only justified in certain scenarios, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to leave it. Is right. This is we're not pushing anybody here, but if you're going to do it, you want to be equipped, right? You want to have what you need in place to stand a chance. There's none of this is easy, and everybody listening knows only too well. Just nothing about this industry is easy, which hopefully you're just a little sharper than the next guy now. So, well, Brian, really appreciate you sharing your insights with our audience. Thank you all for tuning in as always for today's discussion on growth management. Each month we host a new session in the Craft Beverage Conversation series. You can follow Virginia SBDC and sign up for our newsletter for information about future webinars. But for now, I'd like to again thank Brian Becker of Becker Growth Strategy for his time and expertise.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Chris, for another interesting and informative webinar on our Craft Beverage series. And I want to thank everyone who attended today. You will receive an email with a link to the recording. If you would like to sign up for upcoming webinars or access recorded webinars, please visit virginiasbdc.org/training. These resources are designed to be used in collaboration with your local SBDC advisors. You can sign up for a free and confidential session by emailing help@virginiasbdc.org or via our website. And we hope to see you all at our next session. Take care, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye.